Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." So this week we're coming to the third of our signs in John's Gospel. And we saw last week that there were quite a few similarities, there were a few points of connection between sign 1 and sign 2. Well, with this week's sign, we're seeing a bit more variation. For a start, nowhere in the passage that we read does John actually specifically identify this healing as a sign, the way he does with the first two, where he specifically says, this was the first sign, this was the second sign. But it is considered to be one of the signs because if you were to read through chapter 7, which takes place a little bit later, while this miracle is being discussed, there the crowd refer to Jesus' signs while discussing this miracle. And there's also a mention of the signs in chapter 9, which is connected to this passage by discussion of the Sabbath, where Jesus brings up some of the things which come up here. So it is a sign, although not specifically identified within this passage. And the other big difference that strikes me is the location. You remember maybe that both of the previous signs took place in Cana in Galilee. The miracle of the transformation of water into wine at the wedding and the healing of the royal official's son. They both took place in Cana. This miracle, though, John tells us that this miracle takes place in Jerusalem. So this is a different setting entirely. This is the centre of Judaism, not the backwater in Galilee where Jesus had been performing before. Now he's in Jerusalem itself. John's account also tells us that it took place. The reason Jesus was in Jerusalem was because there was a feast of the Jews. Now, quite a lot of ink has been spilled trying to give an argument one way or the other for what festival this was, which of the many festivals that would have taken place this could have been, to try and figure out the chronology and how it all fits together. But my opinion, I think the very fact that this is the only unnamed festival in John's Gospel, it's the only time he tells us there's a festival without naming it, I think that tells us something very important. It tells us that we don't need to know what festival it was. That's not important. It's not part of the story. It's just the reason Jesus was in Jerusalem. It's what places him there. But it is not tied to what John is saying and what John is telling us with this sign. What that also means, I think, is that it helps us to understand the importance of something that comes later. This is not the time marker, if you like, that matters. The fact that it was a festival. This time marker that comes at the start. What is relevant to the shape of the story, to the sign that we are being told about, is another time marker which we get later on in the story, after the first setting of the scene. We'll get to that. But before we do get a more precise location rather than just Jerusalem. This doesn't take place in the temple, as a lot of the other accounts of Jesus' activity in Jerusalem might. This takes place at something called the Sheep Gate. At least we think it does. The Greek manuscripts just say it took place at the place of the sheep. And we know there was a sheep gate. And it takes place at a pool called Bethesda. John tells us that the significance of this pool in Jesus' day was that a large number of people with disabilities, people who were ill, people who were crippled, they would be found here. And one of them was going to play a crucial role in our story this evening. Because this man, we are told, he had suffered from a debilitating illness for 38 years. 38 years he had suffered from this illness. Now the man himself doesn't get named. And John's kind of non-specific about the illness as well. He uses a very general term, which suggests, and so does the context of the story, it suggests that some form of severe lameness and weakness was part of what he suffered from. But we don't actually get told exactly what was wrong with him. So I think it's interesting that we get told how long he had suffered from it. We get told this duration, this 38 years, but we don't get a whole lot of other information which we might have thought was kind of more pertinent. Now, it's probably not coincidental that 38 years was the duration of the wilderness wanderings of the Israelite people after they left Kadesh Barnea, having failed to enter the promised land the first time. 38 years. Now, John doesn't make a big thing of that, so we maybe shouldn't read too much into it, but the fact that he includes it at all, almost certainly John would have realised that his readers would probably make this connection, his first readers, to 38 years. So it is worth us taking note of that this man had been under the oppression of his illness for the same length of time that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness. A generation passed away during that time. So Jesus sees him, and Jesus knows his state. He knows he's been ill for a long time. He knows what's wrong with him, and he asks him a question. Jesus asks him, "Do you want to be healed?" It's quite a question, isn't it? Do you want to be healed? I mean, you think it would be a no-brainer. Do you want to be healed? Do you want to be made whole? The literal wording that John uses, it's unique to John, none of the other gospel writers speak this way, is to become sound. We all need to be made whole. There's something wrong inside every single one of us. There's a brokenness that cuts us off from God. Do you want to become sound? Do you want to be made whole? You'd think it would be a no-brainer. It isn't always, though, is it? How does the man answer? Well, the man says something a little bit odd. He says, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Eh? Jesus says, "Do you want to be well?" And the man gives him this story about not being able to get down to the pool. That's a bit of an odd answer to that question. Now, for those of us who are perhaps a little bit older than this man's illness, you might be familiar with the King James translation and some of the other older translations which have an extra verse and a half before this man speaks. They have an extra verse 4 and a little bit added to verse 3. It sort of makes sense of what the man was saying, but it's now generally considered that it wasn't part of the original text of the gospel. It's something that scribes added as an explanatory note that then got picked up and people assumed it was in there. But it looks like there was a superstition attached to these pools. There was a belief that at random points an angel would come down and stir up the water so that it moved around. And that would precipitate an odd kind of race, because the first person into the water after the angel stirred it, they get healed. Hardlines everybody else. Now, probably that belief sprung from some sort of natural phenomenon that caused the waters to move now and again. But the belief was basically in the form of magic. That if you got into the pool fast enough, you would be magically healed. Now, I said before that this didn't take place in the temple. This is about as far from the temple as you can get. Because you can be pretty sure that the religious authorities did not approve of this kind of superstition. Jesus offers the guy wellness, but he's basically fixated on this superstition. He can't see past this thing that he thinks he needs to have. And he blames his predicament on other people, really, doesn't he? No one will help me into the water. No one will pick me up and put me in. Do you ever do that? Do you ever blame others for your situation instead of taking it to God? Do you make excuses? I could do so much better. I would be sorted. I would be all right if only I had. Insert your own particular thing in there. We all have something that we've thought that about. If only I had this. If only I had that. If only this was in my life. Just like this guy. If only somebody would carry me into the pool. I don't know what he was hoping for telling Jesus this. Maybe he was hoping that Jesus would say, well, I'll carry you. I'll pick you up and take you to the pool the next time it bubbles. But Jesus isn't playing his game. Jesus isn't there to give him what he wants. He's there to give him what he needs. In fact, Jesus is going to do quite the opposite. Jesus tells him to get up. There's no fancy waters. There's no ritual actions. There's nobody else picking him up and carrying him. Jesus says, you get up and you pick up your mat and you carry that. And in verse 9 we read that at once the man was healed and he took up his bed and walked. At once, just like that. Jesus shows the real power to heal, the real power to make someone whole. And it rests not with superstition and not with going through a prescribed set of actions. It rests in Jesus and the power of his word. It is in obeying Jesus' word, in hearing Jesus' word and obeying Jesus' word, that we are made whole, that we become sound. Whatever little things it is that we are trusting in, and before God they are all little things, however big they might seem to us. From the bland and the mundane to the sometimes frankly weird. Whatever else it is we are trusting in, not only do they not help us, but our focus on them stops us from clearly seeing who Jesus is as he stands in front of us until we hear him speak. So far, so straightforward. But that's not everything it says in verse 9, is it? It also says, now, that day was the Sabbath. And so what? Why does that matter more than which festival it was? Why is this the thing that John draws our attention to at this pivotal point in the account? Well, what happens next is we get this exchange with the ones that John refers to throughout his gospel as the Jews. Now, when John says that, he doesn't mean every Jewish person. There have been accusations that John is anti-Semitic. That's ridiculous. John was a Jew. When he talks about the Jews in this way, he is talking about the religious authorities of Judaism, the powerful. Now, first of all, they are angry with this man because they find him carrying his mat on the Sabbath. Now, that's a man-made rule. That's one of their rules, one of the multitude of rules that they had set up in addition to God's rule. With the intention, the good intention, of protecting people from accidentally breaking God's laws. They set up all their own little divisions around and on top of them about how far you could walk on the Sabbath, how much you could lift on the Sabbath, and so on. And then their anger shifts, the focus of their anger shifts when they hear that the reason he's carrying a mat on the Sabbath is because somebody has had the audacity to heal him on the Sabbath. Do you notice that the man still seems to be a little bit in the habit of trying to shift responsibility off himself? Why are you carrying your mat? Oh, this guy told me to do it. He healed me on the Sabbath. Now, initially, he can't tell the authorities the identity of the man who healed him. He still doesn't really know Jesus. But after he finds out, according to John, the first thing he does is he goes and finds the people in authority and he tells them. He reports Jesus for healing him. And of course, the religious authorities don't like this, and John tells us that they start to persecute Jesus all the more because of this. Do you see what's happening here? At no point do these leaders and teachers of Israel, who are supposed to be caring for the people, at no point do they say, hold on. You've been unable to move yourself for 38 years. And now you're walking and you're able to carry your own mat? This is amazing. Praise God for this miracle. That's not their focus, is it? They are more concerned that somebody might be breaking their rules than they are with the fact that someone has been restored, made whole, that someone has become sound. The Sabbath was supposed to be a gift from God. It was supposed to be for our good. God gave it to us for rest and restoration. But by adding all their laws on top of it, they had made it a burden. Not a rest, but a burden. One which meant they would deny even healing to the sick. Now, I think we have to be honest enough to say that we as a church have made that error historically too. We have made the Sabbath a burden. Which is not to say we shouldn't observe the Sabbath. It is not to say we shouldn't take the Sabbath seriously. Of course we should. We should take God's understanding of the Sabbath seriously and not add our own things to it. And we should remember that the Sabbath is a gift. The Sabbath is a rest. The Sabbath is a liberation from bondage, not a new bondage. But that's not how these guys think. So the authorities are challenging Jesus and they are out to get him. And John doesn't specifically say that they speak to Jesus about this, but he does say that Jesus answered them. In verse 17 we read, Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." Let's unpack that statement a wee bit, shall we? Now, part of what he said was something that the religious leaders would have agreed with. They would have been on exactly the same page as him on part of this. The idea that God continued working, even on the Sabbath. That while he may have rested from the work of creation on the seventh day, he was nonetheless working. God was and is constantly at work, sustaining all that is. Without his ongoing work, nothing would exist. He is the creator and sustainer. Now, that would not have sounded particularly radical to the Jews of Jesus' day. They would have been in perfect agreement with that. If Jesus had just said that, they would have gone, well, yes, God is working, even on the Sabbath. They knew that God was always at work. The rest of what Jesus says, though, when he refers to God as my Father, that would have been a bit more, I think controversial is maybe too mild a word, but it's the best I can think of. Quite a lot more. We're used to the idea of talking about God as our Father. Less common in Jesus' day. There might have been this vague idea of him as a kind of symbolic father to the nation. But for Jesus to refer to him as my Father, that was a big claim that he was making. And then after he said that my Father is at work, he goes on to compare his own work to that of his Father, to God. Well, by this sign, by not only healing but doing so on the Sabbath, Jesus was showing something about himself. And the Jews, as John called them, they recognized this. They knew exactly what Jesus was pointing to. Verse 18 says, this was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. See, this sign, it doesn't just point to Jesus as a healer, or Jesus as being real where superstitious magical thinking is fake. It places Jesus on a level with God. The religious readers they weren't actually wrong in thinking that that's what Jesus was claiming. They're dead right about that. But they were wrong in thinking that he was blaspheming by doing so. They were so busy looking for examples of rule breaking that they failed to see the sign. Jesus healed on the Sabbath precisely to show that he was who they feared he was claiming to be. So Jesus is not just a miracle-working magic man. Jesus is God. Jesus is God, come to restore, come to make whole. Come so that we can become sound. Come to give us rest. The real Sabbath. Come to trample on performance-based, works-righteousness attempts to self-save, which are never going to get off the ground. I was going to say they'll never fly. They can't even stand up and walk. So he stands and he calls on you to stop making excuses. Stop blaming others. Stop waiting for that one thing which you think will magically solve everything and make your life okay. Stop looking for them and look at him. Hear his voice as he calls you to get up and be made whole. Amen.